This film is made in support of a group of people who have been illegally mistreated by a corporation that refuses to accept its legal and moral responsibility to these individuals and to the public. We are asking you to watch this film with the hope that you will do something to help resolve this situation in a way that is fair. Here's the story. On May 10, 2013, nearly 5 years after Lawrence Livermore National Security, LLC, violated the law and its own policies by laying off 430 of the lab's oldest and most experienced employees, an Alameda County jury awarded $2.7 million in compensatory damages to 5 of them, confirming that by selecting these employees for termination, the lab acted in bad faith and violated their employment agreements.
130 former Lawrence Livermore Laboratory employees are a part of this lawsuit.
They had to let their long-term workers go who were closer to retirement, who cost them more money for medical, and whose salaries are the highest, and keep the younger workers.
Laid off at the age of 56, started at the age of 17 at the lab.
Despite the jury's finding, lab management is avoiding responsibility for its discriminatory actions by refusing to engage in settlement talks or mediation to resolve these 5 and the remaining 125 claims.
We won this case. It's been 5 years. Now we proved our case in court. Why are you not coming to the table and dealing with this?
Instead, lab management is trying to pass the damages off to the U.S. Department of Energy, where the taxpayers will ultimately bear the cost of its unfair and illegal actions. This will also allow the private Bechtel Group, which now runs the lab along with the UC Regents, to carry on with its profits, untouched despite its liability. The remaining 125 employees who filed suit await trial of their claims for breach of contract and bad faith termination. All 130 employees await trial on a determination of their claims that the lab's actions were discriminatory on the basis of their age. If left to the courts and the lab's continued attempts to delay resolution of these employees' claims, none of these older employees, whose lives were turned upside down by the lab's deliberate employment discrimination, will see any compensation for their losses and suffering in their lifetime. And the corporate giant will profit at these employees' and the public's expense. Something should be done to make Bechtel and its partners accountable for their illegal and discriminatory actions. There had been no layoffs at Lawrence Livermore Lab in 30 years until Bechtel came along. When the lab was privatized in 2007 and Bechtel National, the construction and engineering giant, took over management with the UC Regents, the management fee shot up. Bechtel and the Regents charged the American taxpayers $40 million a year more than they had been paying for running the lab. In order for Bechtel and its partners to secure their profit margin, they immediately began planning to get rid of employees. Only months after taking over management of the lab, 430 employees were laid off.
The layoff that occurred on May 22nd was wrong. Quite simply wrong, and we contend illegal. People who worked there for 20 or 30 years were laid off without warning, marched out.
I felt like a criminal. I felt that the only thing that was missing were the handcuffs. That's how I felt. And, I was a dedicated, loyal employee. I mean, I just couldn't understand how this happened.
Had the lab followed their rules and laid them off in inverse order of seniority, laid them off without regard to age discrimination or otherwise, this layoff would not have occurred.
I had no idea that I was going to be selected for layoff. With my age and my years of service, always had either very good or outstanding performance appraisals.
The lab layoff policy was based on seniority, so it was hard for me to understand how with someone with my years of service could be laid off.
I was one of 3 in my group that were selected for the layoff, and we were the people with the most seniority, 30 years and 29 years or so seniority, the oldest in the group, and the younger ones were kept.
There are 4 people doing my job right now. They are all 13 to 30 years younger than I am and with less seniority.
When Bechtel and the Regents formed the Lawrence Livermore National Security, LLC, all employees entered into a contract with the new management, a contract that said they could only be terminated for reasonable cause. The lab's own policies stated that any termination action must be reasonable under the circumstances and cannot be made for an arbitrary or discriminatory reason.
She told me that I had been selected and I was going to be affected by the layoff. And I said, why? And she said, I'm not at liberty to tell you.
Did anyone ever tell you why you were
Never.
picked to be laid off?
Never to this day.
None of your supervisors
Never.
explained it to you?
Never, not to this day.
During the recent 2-month trial, plaintiff's human resources expert testified how the lab failed to substantiate the reasons these employees were targeted for layoff.
There was a stunning lack of documentation for a committee with these essential functions that I don't recall ever having seen this little documentation in a situation of a layoff. Typically for a variety of reasons, to establish fairness, to make sure that there's no discrimination. You typically see considerable documentation for any decisions that are made that could have impact on the careers of people.
I asked several times, why was I being laid off? And all Kelly would say was that it has to do with your 4th-digit classification code. And I said, how does a person, if they work here for 38 years, I mean, seniority would happen, you know? And it was like she was programmed to say, the 4th-digit classification, that's all she would say.
According to Dr. Robert L. Siviak, a physicist and former national security analyst at the Office of Management and Budget, Lawrence Livermore National Security manufactured a budgeting crisis to justify the 2008 layoffs. In a sworn declaration filed with the court, Dr. Siviak stated, "In my opinion, Lawrence Livermore National Security's claim of a $280 million budget shortfall was likely made in an attempt to get increased funding from the administration and Congress." Only Lawrence Livermore National Security took it another step. They used this phony budget shortfall as an excuse to lay off hundreds of workers for reasons not related to the budget. Lawrence Livermore National Security had sufficient funds to avoid involuntary layoffs. The jury agreed that plaintiffs were laid off without good or reasonable cause, and that by targeting them for layoff, the lab breached their employment agreements and acted in bad faith. According to the jury foreperson, the jurors were suspicious that the lab lacked documentation for many of its layoff decisions. She also said that the jury was swayed by evidence that lab management didn't implement its layoff policy the same across the board. Lastly, she stated that in seeing a list with the ages of those laid off, it was apparent that they were all older employees. Although the issue of age discrimination will be left for another jury, there is substantial evidence that lab management deliberately let go its older, long-term career employees and replaced them with younger workers with less seniority and less pay. Many of the replacements were at-will, flex-term employees who were required to be laid off first under lab policy.
At the time that I left, there were 3 flex-term employees.
During the trial, there was testimony that one of the lab supervisors said, "They're making me get rid of all my seasoned employees and leaving me the babies." Another employee testified that she and her coworkers referred to the day of the layoffs as Gray Day because as they watched their friends leaving the premises, all they saw was gray hair. An expert's statistical analysis of the employee data produced by the lab itself shows that the layoffs were discriminatory to the lab's older employees. The verdict came almost 5 years after the layoffs. Losing their jobs has been devastating to those senior employees who had devoted their talents and longevity to the lab and its mission. Many lost their homes or were forced into bankruptcy. Many others are still looking for work.
This layoff happened on the verge of the biggest recession in my lifetime. I was too young to retire, and I was too old to get a job.
I have not been able to find a job. Not sure why. I believe I'm going to be 62. At my age, I think that might play into it. Probably does. But I haven't been able to find a job.
Right now, I'm 56 years old and scrambling on, what I can do, and so it's very, very emotional.
It's all been very profitable for Bechtel, one of the country's largest privately held corporations, which recently revealed its 2012 earnings at $37.9 billion. We ask that you take action to make Bechtel and its partners accountable for their conduct for the sake of these employees and the public. If you are a member of Congress, hold Bechtel and the UC Regents accountable. Stop them from jeopardizing national security, evading their responsibility to those wrongfully terminated, and from passing off the liability for their wrongdoing to the American taxpayers. If you're in the media, please use your influential voice to expand the reach of this message. If you're a consumer, tell your representatives and senators to stop the loss of experienced scientists, researchers, and professionals in a field that impacts our homeland security. Ask that the American taxpayers stop bearing the burden of Bechtel's profits.